When you look back through your long history of retro games, you of course have plenty of obvious AAA games that pop up in your memory, but hidden away in the shadows of the deepest, darkest corners of your memory, you always have those games that are not necessarily the best, but they do stick with you due to their excellent design. And no game better demonstrates this than Shadow Man. What is it about this game that still constantly plays on my memory? Is it the art style, amazing characters, eerie sound effects, the marketing, the story, or is it all of the above? Sure, playing the original nowadays can be a little bit of a chore, but it turns out that Shadow Man doesn't just sit in the back of my mind, it actually has a hardcore group of people that still look past its dated controls and map layout, among other things. So much so that a rather impressive remake recently got released of a game that, as stated, most people forget exists. Shadow Man is here to stay, a game like so many that's rough around the edges but still does everything else right to make it a timeless experience, which is why I feel that it deserves its place in the complete history lineup. So join me as we go back to the beginning with Shadow Man, the complete history, where we'll be looking at the game's origins, who made it, the struggles along the way, the terrifying concepts used to create the characters, and of course, the games themselves. Welcome to Slope's Game Room. Our story starts back in October of 1995 when a young Simon Phipps, who had just made his way to UK studio Teesside. If that studio doesn't sound instantly familiar, that would be because the studio, like many UK studios, had changed its hand a fair few times, starting off as Optimus Software before being purchased by Iguana Entertainment and becoming Iguana UK, and finally being bought out again by Acclaim, renaming it Acclaim Teesside due to it being based in, well, Teesside. Simon had built up a bit of a name for himself, working on plenty of notable titles at several very well-respected UK-based studios, and when he joined Teesside, he got to work finishing up the NBA Jam-originated College Slam with the rest of the team. And straight after, Simon, who was in charge of a team who had just created their third basketball game, decided to give them a break and let them work on an original title. The idea was to create a 3D action horror game, and with some encouragement from the head office of Acclaim in New York, they proposed for them to create a Resident Evil-like game but in full 3D. The request resulted in several concepts being written up until the team landed on a character called Thomas Deacon, an ex-NYPD officer turned demon hunter. This pitch actually ended up being quite positively received by the suits up top. However, shortly after this, they got a stack of Valiant comics and were asked to choose one of the characters to make a game about. You see, Acclaim had already purchased Valiant Comics back in 1994 and had released a few games based on those properties, with Exo Manowar teaming up with Marvel's Iron Man and the wildly popular Turok series. And now, the team gets to choose from Ninjak, the British spy turned teenage lad who could switch into the video game character of the same name to fight crime. The funny thing was, even though the game existed in the comics, it never got made in real life. Magnus Robot Fighter, set in the future year of 4000 but originally created in the 60s, this super funky futuristic looking world has become overly dependent on robots being our servants. Every so often one of those robots goes rogue and Magnus, as the name suggests, fights them. Bloodshot is a super hardcore hero that is made from an army of microscopic machines inside of his body that allow him to essentially heal himself, similar to how Wolverine does, and for whatever reason, that leaves a big old red circle on his chest, hence the name Bloodshot. Trinity Angels were one that I had not heard of before, but according to the Valiant fandom page, they are a trio of sisters who gain mystical powers through an incident that also caused them to wear incredibly skimpy clothing. I might need to do a bit more research on these ladies. And of course you had Shadow Man, the alter ego of Michael Leroy, someone who can walk between worlds in order to protect the living, aka the live side, from the evil spirits of, you guessed it, the dead side. And considering they were looking to make a horror game anyway, Shadow Man seemed like the perfect fit. Now I'm sure I've given all of those classic comic book fans a raging vein right across their head because 1, I've oversimplified this, and 2, well, the origin story of most superheroes has been redone countless times. However, it is important that you put yourself into the mindset of the people adapting this game. Not only was this from the Acclaim run of Shadow Man comics, but at this point in time, the story was only 4 issues in, and because of this, the team adapted what they had to hand. As an example, the majority of the fighting in the earlier comics run was done in the live side, but with a cool mechanic like this, in the world of video games, no way would fans want to be doing that. The creation of the game exploded the team from 15 to 70, and this was the first 3D action-based game that the majority of the team had ever worked on. No one said moving from 2D to 3D would be easy. Thankfully, a guy called Ed Skio had recently joined the company and created a very basic 3D engine that he didn't really know what to do with, and of course, that ended up as the basis for this game. The growing team developed skills and different techniques that would be used in the game as they went along, and even though the story had already been worked out, designing the levels had not. Just imagine going from a 2D plane and then having to adapt everything you know into 3D and make those 3D worlds work kind of in reverse as you go backtracking. The method they came up with was to actually sketch out each area like an architect's plan and then hand it over to a team in order to transfer to 3D before adding all of the usual textures and lighting, as well as plenty of experiments, including the change up of having texture skins on the characters in order to remove joint splitting arms and legs that were all too common at this point with other games in the genre. The game itself, retrospectively, is without a doubt very rough around the edges. Upon release, it got a hell of a lot of good reviews, but for gamers that were more used to similar 3D action games such as Soul Reaver and of course Tomb Raider, yeah, this one is most definitely a bit stiff. As always though, when you do get used to the way the game feels, you can of course move on and enjoy the mechanics and story that the game has to offer. Now again, upon release, I wasn't exactly the biggest fan. I was spending too long going out, getting drunk, getting fired from meaningless jobs, spending all my money on new clothes, clubbing, DJing, and when it come down to video games, I was pretty much only into arcade-like action. Shadow Man just didn't fit the bill. Shadow Man isn't exactly a pick up and play game. In fact, the first 30 minutes to an hour are a bit slow. The fantastic story most definitely went over my bleach tipped and spiked head back in the day, and it wasn't until several years later that I finally understood what it had to offer. The story in Shadow Man is fantastic, using your dead brother's teddy bear as a way to jump between worlds so that you can kill the 5 killers on the dead side who plan to bring in the apocalypse. But besides Shadow Man himself, all of the other characters actually got played really well. The Irish-speaking snake, the voodoo priestess, heck, if they could keep my simple mind entertained, then they were doing something right. Gameplay wise, besides the actual worlds being at times a little confusing to work out, it still feels good, taking elements from classic 3D adventure games like the aforementioned Tomb Raider, but mixing in some Metroid, some Zelda-like gameplay, along with a voodoo art style that really does give the game its unique appeal. It really does show the team pushed every aspect that they could, the design, the music, the voice acting. They really did the best of their ability for 1999. As stated, it's aged quite a bit, as has some of gaming's greats, but when you put it right next to the endless barrage of games in the same genre for the era, this one deserves to be remembered, and it deserves to be played even to this day. My suggestion is just to give it a good go. Don't be put off straight away, do what you can to get through the first couple of hours, and for the best possible experience in the noughties and beyond, you should probably be checking out the remaster, which, as you can see, when compared to the Dreamcast using a high-end emulator, is utterly fantastic. Now, unlike other remasters like Crash and Spyro, this one hasn't been remade from the ground up, but instead it's had the vast majority of its textures redone with a few little tweaks here and there, with the controls making it really just a slightly more revamped version of the original. Some of those 1999 annoyances are still here, and from what I can tell, it really is the same game through and through in the gameplay arena, plus some additional cut content too, which does mean a few of the enemies from the base games have had to be moved around and placed into different areas in order to keep the soul count to 120. You can take that as a bad or as a good thing, your mileage is obviously gonna vary. Regardless, none of this really matters for fans of the original. I highly suggest still going back and using that remastered version, and for everyone that refuses to play classic games with HD textures, well, you can actually turn them off anyway and still get all of the new lighting, cut content and widescreen support that it offers. So, no big deal. No matter how you play it, if you do give it time and get past that learning curve of playing a 20-plus-year-old action platforming adventure type game, then you will and definitely should feel what the team was going for. I explained how this was the majority of the 70-strong crew's first 3D platformer game, but it doesn't show. After looking at interviews and actually playing the game, it's apparent that the entire team, and not just the Lees, wanted to really push the boundaries of what this sort of game could offer to the player. The sound team didn't just make a great soundtrack, they added eerie sounds to certain elements in the game for no other reason than to get the player questioning what they just heard. The design team, between jobs and in their spare time, would constantly be drawing anything they could that might fit into the game, and in some aspects, those designs actually did, like the flesh-covered windmill. Long hours, sleepless nights, and a hardcore mentality to constantly want to add things in that would really send a shiver down the spine of the players who wouldn't experience these elements in other more notable horror franchises was the goal here, and for the time, it definitely worked. But without a doubt, one of the big examples of all of this were the bosses found in the game. As stated, the job is to defeat 5 evil bosses in order to stop the apocalypse. The first one, and the most obvious, is of course Jack the Ripper, who was based on the original Jack the Ripper from 1888, who murdered 5 victims in an incredibly brutal fashion involving loads of stabbing and slicing. Yes, real-life serial killers. Now, to be fair, out of the 5, only 4 have definite connections with real-life killers, as Marco Cruz, aka the Repo Man, is a little tough to connect. He was a funky disco DJ who would pretend to be a Repo Man to get into your house and kill you. As stated, this one hasn't ever really been pinned down to a real-world connection. However, in previews, all 5 were based on real people in some way. The remaining 3 are Milton Pike, who is believed to be based on the serial killer Gary Ridgway, better known as the Green River Killer, who was convicted of killing 49 people but confessed to 7. He served in the war just like the game's killer, and as for the videotaping side of the killer, well, of course, that could have been a number of different serial killers. Avery Marks is better known as the Home Improvement Killer and is likely based on Ed Gein, as is so many other horror movie icons. Ed may have only killed 2 people, but he also dug up the corpses of several more to repurpose their skin and bones in order to make sheets, bowls, leggings, face masks, belts, and so much more. And finally, you got Victor Batrakian, who is believed to be based on the GP Harold Shipman, who likely killed approximately 250 mostly elderly ladies after he convinced them to leave him large sums of money in their wills before they all died of drug overdoses. These are the characters, or at least believed to be the characters, found in this particular game. If that team was going for bone-chilling content, they definitely achieved it, especially since that last serial killer I mentioned was actually convicted around about the same time as this game's development. That was Shadow Man, a mostly well-received game on all platforms besides the PlayStation, where it was sadly rushed and unfortunately did not live up to the other ports. For most people watching before the remaster, it was the Dreamcast, which was of course the go-to port of choice, and it was the N64 release where the hardcore fans lie. And it did well enough for Shadow Man 2 to almost instantly start development, this time on everyone's favourite Dreamcast shelf, the PlayStation 2. Thankfully, the first game ended in a way to make the sequel story fit in quite nicely, and that's exactly what the team got straight into doing from the beginning. Simon Phipps and Guy Miller got to work designing and directing the 2-year developed sequel. However, only 9 months in, Simon left the studio to ventures new, as did a whole heap of other members of staff who worked on the original title. The entire development was slow, it had constant change-ups during that development, and the way the studio marketed the game didn't help things either. Hey, fancy promoting the game on your dead relatives' tombstones? Yeah, that one didn't exactly go down too well, especially when the marketing department said that poorer families may be interested in this. Ouch. Thankfully, that didn't end up happening, but the game did, and as you can see, the Shadow Man himself looks completely different. Now look, it's really not terrible. It's far more action-based than before, the storyline is also very forgettable, and the redesign of the characters look like they've come from a completely different game. But in its defense, because it's more action-based and because it came out a couple of years after the original, you could argue that this game controls better than what came before it. The end result is a game that honestly isn't all that bad. It's definitely not as bad as everyone makes out. It's just that the PlayStation has over 3,800 games on it, and this one is just one of the average ones. It really is a shame, because the potential to carry on with what the original game brought to the table would have been brilliant. But alas, what we got is a game so perfectly mediocre that the hardcore fan base, for the most part, didn't really care about its existence, nor did the original development team care about preserving it. Yes, apparently the code to this game has been long lost, and the studio was shut down soon after. Shadow Man is a series that may not have been the best, but like so many other games, it did what it did well and provided an atmosphere with its style, art direction and music that few other games can pull off. To this day, Facebook and Reddit groups continue to thrive with more and more people who look back through their long history of games and choose to reminisce about Shadow Man, primarily on the N64. Thankfully, in more recent years, a remake of that original game continues to bring in fans as well as relight the flame for retro fans, and as always, the Shadow Man comics and graphic novels continue to be one of the best sellers for Valiant Entertainment, now that the licenses have all been bought back from Acclaim, who own the rights during this game's run. And even though we have got the remake, I think it goes without saying that a reboot should most definitely be on the cards next.